Hey, what's up? I'm just gonna tap in for a quick video, and I'm just gonna begin this by saying that this live tap on this channel is part of just a continued series of ideas and videos. But with the phone that I use, it's a lot simpler to capture it as a live stream. So the live streams get a little bit better traction than the videos, but this is intending to flesh out ideas, and also it's created as a video, so it's a record of it. So it's more like a video journal. But I'm gonna engage with the audience if the audience appears. But otherwise, I'm wanting to convey ideas and capture ideas as a skill set, and also a record, and say that having original thoughts, original insight is it's a skill set, and but it's also a living capacity. In the holy text, they would say that there were one thing that's profound is when you can draw connections between different heritages and different lines of thought. So one connection between the Holy Bible and India is that they said, according to Arthur Avalon, any sincere student of music of any sincere student of religion will at one point find themselves in India, or thinking or learning of India, or learning of or receiving influences from India, if you were to really become an ardent student of religion. But I found that it's like that with many things. If you were to become an ardent student of art, of like say architecture, like the Taj Mahal, music par excellence, really music par excellence, both on the instrumental side and the vocal side. Mathematics in the West, a lot of people. I was talking to someone, I was having a deep conversation, and I was like, where do you think numbers come from? And then she was like, they come from time. And I was like, no, but where do numbers come from? And where do we get our numbers from? The ones we use. She said, numbers are from time, they're the universe. But I said, no, our numbers are from our actual, our digits. Because like we're in a digital system, a binary system, ones and zeros, but the concept of 10 and numbers that all come from our 10 digits of our hands, but also our toes. That's a Hindu Arabic numeral system, according to Algebra for Dummies by Mark Zigarelli, the iteration that came about 2014. So that's just an example of that. Anything that you would take seriously, art, music, mathematics, science, technology, you'll likely be benefited and find your way back to India. So one thing that Arthur Avalon said is that in India, there's certain things called siddhis, which are capacity. When you undergo a quest to learn something, or like they would say, like the Holy Grail, that man himself, Arthur Avalon, that comes from the story of the Holy Grail, like with Sir Lancelot. And if you recall Lord of the Rings, when he says, "You shall not pass," J.R. Tolkien almost egregiously lifted that and appropriated that from the story of I'm sorry, the story of, I think it's Camelot, or the Holy Grail. And so there was a fighter, there was a knight named Sir Lancelot, and he was fed up with winning. He couldn't be defeated, and he actually, it's kind of strange thing. It's actually like an example of sadomasochism. So as a human being, we're all both sadistic and masochistic. It's kind of like, so you can say that life has some necessary evils in it. They say death and taxes are guaranteed, but also death and taxes make life, because life is death, death is life. And when you make love to another person, when you're in love at all, but also when you make love, you die to one another and you're reborn through one another. So in the olden sense, like nowadays, like, I don't mean to be egregious, but like nowadays people would say like the word cum, like cum. That a lot of people, that's actually like a point of coming of age, when a person would actually realize what that word means. That's a level of development for a human being, when you realize what the word come means, the difference from com to cum. But a deeper thing is that in the olden days, that word come, like that actually meant to, that's actually what it is to make love, and to sire, to conceive a child. But it's actually a deeper thing, is to die to one another. So at that actual moment, they say that when a human being reaches a climax like a male, about 30 days worth of living. So the energy that it takes to live in one day, all the things the stress that it takes to go through one day, the energy like that energy that it takes to get out of bed in the morning, that you can't just get right out of bed. You have to have enough of will and incentive to actually muster the first step, because the first step of any journey is the hardest, even in a day. So that actual energy that it takes to lift one foot out of bed like that, the energy of about 30 days is what it is for a male to climax. But a deeper thing is that's actually like a mini death, but also that energy, that 30 days worth of living of a climax of a male, that can amount to a whole nother life in lifetimes, in generations, in thousands and tens and hundreds of thousands of years of living of a human being. That actual that impetus of a conception like that. But it has to be regenerated through living and striving and suffering and resting and eating and sleeping and defecating. But that actual momentum, that energy, the baton of that can exist in one siring and conceiving of a child. But that's actually a form of dying like that. And so in the older sense, lovemaking is dying, is death. But you could say that making love, sex, is a necessary evil, because there's some things evil in it. According to I read a book about actual magic, and that's what the topic of this video I want to talk about. But that video about that book about magic said that when you speak at all, when you enunciate, just to talk, there's good and bad, in light and dark. In all things have light and dark, including our very speech, our very utterance. Shall you utter a sound, that sound contains both light and dark, because it's balanced and tempered by this reality. I think that might be one of the reasons that words are so heavy, because one way, if you say the right thing, you can open a window of opportunity, you can be blessed. That'd be the exception. But in general, if you say anything at all, there can be hell to pay for anything that you say. You can really be, and the worst outcome is suffering imaginable of human being can be a consequence of speaking wrong. But that shows the power of words, but also that words contain both light and dark. Such too is life itself, life and dark, and so too is the birthing of a child and the dying, from one generation to the next. But lovemaking itself is it's light and dark, and it's a necessary evil. Such too are taxes. But that story of like Camelot and the Holy Grail, that scene from Lord of the Rings where he said, "You shall not pass." That was that was from a point where Sir Lancelot was traveling, and I think he was drawing knights unto himself, and he was forming like a pact of different knights. But there was one knight that did not allow Sir Lancelot to pass, and they had a bout there. And I think that's also where the author I often quote, Sir John Woodruff, draws his name, Sir Arthur Avalon, is from that Holy Grail, Sir Lancelot. But I just wanted to point out that had been appropriated by J.R. Tolkien, that "you shall not pass," and had an entirely different meaning than when Gandalf leveled that when it was in that story. But such as that India has a lot to offer, such as like our numbers like that. But the deeper thing I want to say is that when a person goes on a quest like that, sadhana like that, what that amounts to are different siddhis, that are different propensities in a human being that amount all the way up to enlightenment. But below that and up to that and next to that are certain propensities, such as are very like to be a very articulate is a siddhi. To be able to sing is another form of articulation and eloquence. That's a siddhi. To be able to draw well, to think well, to write well, to understand well. These are different siddhis, and they're attended by different. If you look at any propensity that you have, a real blessing and strong suit that you have in this world, in this life, that was attended by different degrees of striving by you and or your ancestors to afford you that propensity and or that opportunity. And there were dangers in that. The greatest undertaking that a person can undergo, and the most dangerous too, according to Arthur Avalon, is the quest of knowledge. This sadhana for jhana, knowledge, jhana yoga. And you would think that maybe the most dangerous and arduous thing you could do would be like, say, a military conscription or something like that. But according to Arthur Avalon, the quest of knowledge is the highest quest, the most taxing, the most arduous, the most dangerous. If you think about how much you're exposed, but whatever you have to risk to gain experience, that is understanding, that is wisdom, that is the most you can risk in this world, but also the most you can stand to gain. And these are siddhis. But in the Holy Bible, they would call them gifts of the Spirit, and they'd be like such as speaking in tongues. I'm communicating with a friend that I met where I'm at, and she's been she prayed tongues over me. And when she prayed it, I grew up in a gospel church, and I heard people pray tongues on a stage, like on an altar. But actually to have this woman speak tongues to me, and this woman was an African American. I more so came across tongues in the gospel church, but I think they may be also in different iterations of Christian churches that are not predominantly African American. But this woman was Hispanic, but when she prayed tongues in my midst, she was eloquently, she was speaking tongues more eloquently than I've ever heard someone speak English or any other language into my face. She was really actually communicating in her spirit. I met another person recently who is Creole, and he said that he's actually heard people pray in Creole. That would actually be beautiful and profound to hear someone pray in Creole. But that speaking of tongues, that's an example of a gift of the Spirit. But in India, that'd be called a siddhi. And so I just want to say that's an actual connection and an overlap between Indian tradition and heritage, as in Bharata Dharma, the ethics and the morality and the spirituality of India. Bharata is a word for India. And then the Holy Bible, the canon of the Holy Bible, the books of the Holy Bible would say the gifts of the Spirit, which involve things like prophecy and speaking in tongues. And so these are what would be called siddhis and can be attained by sadhana, undergoing something arduous. But what I wanted to talk about in this video a little bit is sometimes like I've been a proponent on this channel that when you hear words like drug, the word drug is it's a political, it's a social engineering, it's a malleable, potent, viable unit and increment and tool of social engineering, because to the real actual power part, think about how power has impacted your life. Think about the people in your life that you can't get over, that you want to get over, that you can't, that you don't want to get over, that you also can't. The people that really moved your life, shifted your life, changed your life. You cannot deny what that person did to you, impacted you, did for you, did about you. That is influence. The deepest form of power is influence, because influence guides attention and also garners and coerces and marshals attention, and that amounts to power, action, that is thought, or thought in the first place. Where your attention goes, your thought goes, your action goes, your life, your existence, those who you're responsible for, those who you're responsible toward, all that goes where your attention goes. But also your attention is moved by influence, by and large. Influence is not only sexually potent and viable, but a lot of influence has sexual potence and overtones and viability. And so influence is actual really power. But so with that, to actually have real power, as much power as a president, more power than a president or a king, who can you think of that would have more power, as much power and more than a president and or slash king and or slash dictator? That might be an actual media specialist, a propaganda specialist, someone who can get an entire nation to move to war or away from war, to move towards commercialism or away from commercialism, towards productivity or degeneracy, towards peace and understanding, i.e. Martin Luther King, and or fighting mayhem, bloodshed, money-making, drug dealing, as in like Eazy-E, Eric Wright, as he did with hip-hop. Not to be egregious, because a lot of people enjoy hip-hop, and that's part of our culture too. The rough part, the ratchet stuff, that's part of our culture too. So I don't mean to pass judgment on Eazy-E, but you could say that Eazy-E, Eric Wright, is tantamount and on par with a lot of where culture and hip-hop, and like especially like with gangster rap, has gone, almost tantamount and paramount and parallel and on par, near about, as far as consequences go, is our great Dr. Martin Luther King, whose real name may have been Michael, according to Todd Street Bay. And so I'm just saying that that's the actual power of influence. I would say that Eazy-E, Eric Wright, had more power, more consequence, more effect on living and loving and dying and suffering and enjoyment in America, and then the world to follow suit, America and the black community as case in point, and as the real engine of American productivity, creativity, and culture par excellence, that would filter and affect the world over. The black community as case in point. The black community has had the hardest of bearing, the hardest of burdens, potentially on earth. So generally speaking, relatively speaking, arguably on earth, the plight of African Americans, so much as to amount to ethnogenesis, and actually constitute an ethnicity born unto itself within recent hundreds of years as the Majora people. that would be called African American since the Jesse Jackson campaign in the 80s, but prior to that, the American Negro. But then with you could say that Easy E of any American African majority member, Easy E pound for pound had he really pulled a lot of weight in terms of what his influence meant to hip hop, to money making, to American culture, to the world over. That to Martin Luther King. Those two men, I think, have had more impact and influence on outcomes in on human beings. Martin Luther King, by and large, in an enlightened way, but Easy E also in a semi enlightened way for how profound it is, but also with some also real maybe atrocities to go with that. That amount of influence is more than any single president, I think. I arguably maybe you could say Reagan did a lot of damage with some of his decisions, and I'm not saying that the decisions of a president are less tantum or paramount than those two men, Easy E and Eric Wright. But as one man can shift outcomes and really move a people and nation, that is power, real actual. Like Easy E used to wear those gloves like that. Gloves really reflect power. Gloves are a symbol of power. Have you ever seen someone wear gloves very eloquently, especially like in weather? Like I'm from Minnesota, but if you see someone where imagine like heaven forbid like a Nazi wearing gloves, or a president to be a president-elect wearing gloves, Easy E himself wearing gloves like that. That's actual real power. But it's in his case, Easy E, it's influence that he had. So I'm saying that influence is the unit of, if you want to say, the most potent of power at all. The unit, the increment, the means by way of that the most of power is expressed and enjoyed and operated and suffered is in influence, and influence is subject to perception, to both cooperation, but cooperation is subject to perception and appeal. You have sex appeal within that by and large, but not only sex appeal, also the appeal of competence, the appeal of strength, the appeal of culture, the appearance of erudition, the appearance of faith, spirituality, religion, danger, corruption. All these different appeals can be different levels of appeal that amount to influence, that amount to perception and attention and a thought, then action, then consequence, then weight, then outcomes, then groups, then outcome, then circumstances, and in a loop like that. But because of that, the word drug itself, that's on a lot of perception, and the way that influence works is visual by and large, but it doesn't stop there, and that's not the most powerful means, or actual the viability of it is in words, because even if you have this eloquent, this perfect appearance, you must at some point interface with and deal in terms of words to communicate to us, because the real power, the real actual power is not in influence in itself, it's in the meeting of the minds. That's done by way of communication. So communication is within influence, and what influence is actually a form of communication. The communication is the actual power, omnipotent power, perfect power, true power, raw power, polished power is in communication. That is the meeting of the minds. If you've ever actually experienced communication in your life with someone, I've experienced it 2 times. With my best friend growing up, I leveled an insight that occurred to me, and our minds clicked inside of a computer lab at a state school in Minnesota where he was attending. And at that, he said that he believed in that moment that his mind was freed. And at that moment, the connection of our minds, I think that some of that was engendered by our growing up together, because they say that when you have a relationship, even a friendship is a relationship, when you have a long-standing relationship with someone, that constitutes a degree of intimacy, whether you were lovers or not. He and I were not lovers, but we were beyond brothers and friends. We were very close. You actually communicate, according to Rollo Tomasi, when you're that involved with the person and have that much history and reciprocity, you communicate like one another, you start to resemble one another, you're associated with one another, people think of the two of you together, but also your minds can communicate ideas that wouldn't be possible between people that were less well acquainted or strangers, or even that had less of experience or less of reciprocity and peer set together. Your minds communicate differently. So an insight that occurred to me was what it means to the actual idea of relativity. I communicated to him my understanding of relativity. I had read the book, the Wu-Tang Manual by RZA, and that book, it references the nations of gods and earths, and a figure named Clarence 13X, who understood that that what as above, so below. All the things that constitute and exist in this universe abroad, above, throughout the ethers and the regions of space, also on par to scale, represent are existing contained within any being, including a human being a human progenitor, and so on par but no less potent to scale, less of size but no less of potent, is an actual human being, a creative human being with your ability to reason, perceive, manipulate things with your hand, communicate ideas through speech, and beyond. That actually I had a guitar teacher who said that if you would actually started to separate us from, there's a few things that started to separate us from the other primates as human beings. One is that when we began when we I think that a lot of our mind and our body, it corresponds to trees. If you've ever seen box elder bugs, box elder bugs are so prolific around maple trees that when you see them around the trees, you would think, as a human being, you would think that the tree is infested with box elder bugs. But a deeper way to look at it is that the actual box elder bugs are the tree. They're so endemic to the tree. They're so present with the tree. They're so numerous within and about the vicinity of the tree. Is that they're the tree? They're airborne. They can fly. They're a little bit lazy to fly. They have these sophisticated wings and they can take off and fly, but they rarely do so. And when they do, they don't go far from the maple tree, such as that they're the actual maple tree. But I think that us human beings, what is a human being? I think that a human being is a tree. You would say you as a human being are a bloodline that is a family tree. Human beings can be very easily understood even by a child if you were to show someone a tree branching off. But we think that that's a metaphor, that we are branches of a tree, our heritage. No, to my taste, we are not. It's not metaphorical that we're branches of a tree. We actually are branches of a tree, mobile extensions of a tree, and we're only viable by means of trees. We can go into desert regions, we can go into outer space, but not without bringing with us parts of a tree, things that grow from a tree. So we're still actually trees, even though we can do anything as human beings. We can go in airplanes, in spaceships, in boats, in submarines, in desert regions, in mountain regions, but not without hiking with us or sending back for or being sent for something that came from trees and seeds like trees. So we're still actually trees. But to that, it's likely that our opposable, I had a guitar teacher that said that what really separates us and lets us do all the things that are impressive for human beings. If you ever feel something really powerful, like you get on a motorcycle and you get comfortable going past 50 miles an hour and you're now at highway speed on a motorcycle, there's very few things that feel like that, or probably can feel like that. But the ingenuity of that, the ability to do that with to create and fashion and manipulate and operate a motorcycle like that and feel the power of that, is because of our opposable thumb and what we can do with our mind and with reality, physical material reality, based by means of, and probably ether too, by means of our opposable thumb. But that has to do with manipulating trees, climbing trees. Then too, the fact that we stand on 2 feet like that, that likely has to do with trees. And then that too, according to Osho, by standing erect like human beings do, the blood in our body sits different. Like a lot of times, you can imagine a head rush, right? If you, me talking like this, right? I could not talk like I am. I could not convey these ideas if I were sitting on the ground, because if I were doing so, the blood in my body would sit different. It would saturate my brain. My brain actually wouldn't be cognizant. I wouldn't have as much short and long-term memory and presence of mind and cognizance to convey and capture and render a litany of ideas and make them abstract ideas and bring them together in a cogent, coherent way that makes sense. I couldn't do that if I was laying on if I was laying prone on the ground, because the blood would sit differently. But according to Osho, by us becoming Homo erectus, erect, that actually makes the blood sit differently. So some of our higher order thoughts are possible because we are Homo erectus, and that corresponds with trees. That too, because of that, being on 2 feet like that. And then that too, with our more exposed skin, most, I think technically human beings, we're primates. I'm sorry, apes are primates. Monkeys are primates, apes are primates. I think that human beings are also primates. We're closely related to apes. I think we're the most related to chimpanzees, is what we're the most related to. But all those apes, chimpanzees, monkeys, orangutans, gorillas, they're different tiers of primates, which we are a species of primate. But one thing that makes us unique is that we have less of hair. According to my dad, who is a scholar, he's a professor. He's been a professor and a scholar. He has his PhD. He says that because we have less hair, it allows us to cool ourselves with sweating. So those other primates, gorillas, apes. So I'm sorry, I think we're apes technically and primates, but gorillas, chimpanzees, orangutans, monkeys, they, even though they're erect like we are by and large, they can't travel the long distances that we can because they would get very hot like that. They would be, you would be very, if you imagine like I'm in a warm area now, it gets very hot under the sun in the daytime. That would be by orders of, that'd be by orders of magnitude more unbearable if we had as much hair as the apes and the gorillas and the primates, such that when it gets that hot, they have to sit in the shade. They must sit in the shade, or they probably would likely die and overheat. Different athletes have, like I'm from Minnesota, and some athletes back in the day, an athlete actually died at one of these summer training camps, I think for the NFL, the Vikings, if I'm not mistaken, like maybe around 2000, between 2007 and 2010, if I'm not mistaken. I was working at a clerk in that time, and I remember a man died of heat exposure, I think, on the Vikings, if I'm not mistaken. But that episode, that he was probably exerting himself more than his natural. Some of these things that we do for sports to impress one another and impress coaches, and impress audiences, that's not an actual regular level of human exertion, because human beings are a little bit lazy by nature because we conserve energy, and we wouldn't have as much profuse food available as we do now, such that things like marathons, ultra marathons, triathlons, a lot of sports like NFL stuff, that's not a normal human output to do like that, and it may not be healthy. I'm just gonna say it may not be healthy, so that you have had people that can fall out in these things. But with more hair, that you could not do anything. So even with less of hair like humans do, when it gets hot, you must, or you need to, you're inclined to go in the shade, and you could dehydrate quicker if you're not in the shade, or overheat if you're not in the shade. But because we're human beings, we can suck it up, and we can travel further, as our ancestors likely did and had to do, to get as far as dispersed as we are. But I just want to say that those are some of the things that make us human, is that we're Homo erectus, so we have some of the higher order thoughts and reasoning that's possible by standing. We have according to my dad, we have the opposable thumb, according to my music teacher, one Ashanti, my original teacher, who said that that's how we can manipulate and rot things. I think that also appears in the book Human. There's a book called Human that talks about some of these things, and that book refers to the opposable thumb. Then we stand up erect, that I have extrapolated that comes that we interface with trees at all. Then too, a lot of our sophistication in thought and reasoning is a function of socializing and social etiquette, because human beings, primates in general, apes, primates in general, are highly power oriented, because just actually to stand at all, to stand on 2 feet, the thoughts that come with that, the posture that comes with that, and then some of the physical realities and social realities of standing on 2 feet, it's amounts to power. So apes at all are very power conscious, power hungry, power viable, power. There's a lot of etiquette around power for all of apes, and they're socializing, and that to humans. But some of our sophistication in thought is to compensate with the actual politics that are at play, and because we're social by nature also as primates and apes, that constitutes and necessitates and demands and facilitates and is politics par excellence. There's no, for human beings, there is no getting away from politics. There is no getting away from politics for human beings. No such thing that I can conceive of, because we're social in the first place. That is politics, social politics, social. Some people say that person is very social. What is it to be social? That is political. But that actual, the sophistication of that, if you really knew, like for example, I watched the channel, The Game Spitter on YouTube. He talks a lot about hip hop lifestyles, and I want to reference a video he made recently too on this video. When he breaks down the streets, hip hop, rock and roll, America, he breaks it down in the most sublime of political terms of what's really at play and what's really are causing the consequences and realities for people. But if you actually appreciate how sophisticated he's speaking, it's actually beyond what you would call it's actually beyond political science, because it's political science is for books, but he's talking about real no holds barred streets, wild wild west 2026. That's actually more sublime than rocket science and political science combined. But that's where some of our mind and our communication is that sophisticated. And so our mind being as competent and potent as it is to facilitate the socializing and the politics and the communication in the first place. And then all the other things we do, like the fancy things we do, the actual the cool stuff we do, the rocket ships, the motorcycles, the buildings and stuff like that, that's secondary, that's ancillary and supports merely the communication, the politics, and the socializing, but none of that other stuff is viable. You can have all the Harley, you can have all the cool motorcycle, all the rocket ship, but you can't fuel it with the damn fuel if you're not politically and socially viable and also using communication. Because if people don't stamp with that, they don't rock with that, you don't get to do that cool shit. You have to go home with your ball if you get to go home with your ball. If the politics and the communication and the socializing aren't there yet, and that's the same thing like Robert Greene talks about that a lot in his books about power. He has books about power, seduction, human nature, and success in general. It's in his series, Robert Greene. And Robert, in his tomes of books, these large books he has, but in those books he says that nothing is outside of politics, including science. Like you imagine Galileo. So I think Galileo, he had like a telescope that he discovered, and he created the telescope. Then that too, with this telescope, he discovered new planets. When he discovered those planets, he exactly named those planets wisely after the family that was supporting him, that was subsidizing him, that had commissioned him to be viable as an astronomer, as an astrologer, as a scientist, and not be beholden to the rigors of life as a peasant, as he otherwise would be. So he too was wise, and he aligned himself. I think it was like the Medici family or something like that. He aligned himself with that family politically, socially, in communication, and honoring them, and that made him viable. So even the telescope discovering the world is round and stuff like that, that's not viable without politics and socializing and communication. And actually, even the sophisticated stuff we do, like science, medicine, astronomy, that's mere child's play next to and is not viable, as children wouldn't be viable without their parents, without socializing, politics, and communication. So I just wanted to say that with this video. But the deeper thing is that, to that vein, in that light, the word drug is it's a coinage and tool and euphemism and unit of social engineering, and it impacts human outcomes. But it's a bastardization. Drugs themselves, as they're understood by and large, at large, as simple-mindedly. If you were to simple-mindedly understand or approach or appreciate or experience drugs, that's a lot different than entheogens, as is called by that can be different than entheogens, as is called by Morris Brooklyn, a fellow YouTuber, and my actual more than a peer, an actual a superior and a senior YouTuber to myself. I had met him in person, but he's more critical, and he cites his sources more carefully than I do. Or I'm not saying not necessarily more carefully. According to Nassim Nicholas Taleb, it's okay and it's actually preferable to cite things and to reference things that you've read, that you've been interested in, and as they would occur to you. According to Nassim Nicholas Taleb, like what I'm doing to improvise and do extemporaneous talking, like I'm doing now, dialoguing that's unscripted, but still is in line with things I've thought about and looked into. That's as I can congruently and have different sources at my command of thought, being able to reference from memory while dialoguing to Nassim Nicholas Taleb, that's viable and that's more compelling and interesting than to pick up a source with the intention of citing it, or to look into it to do research for the sake of research, and not for the sake of learning and interest and passion and joy and enjoyment. So that's not bogus, but for these type of things, and in like science at all, in medicine at all, in theologians at all, Morris Brooklyn is excellent on his content on YouTube. But just to understand the distinction between entheogens and drugs, and that drugs too are entheogens, entheogens too are drugs. Drugs so-called are actually entheogens, but sometimes when operating as so-called drugs or found as so-called drugs, they can be bastardized, as is the word drug. But entheogens are that too, and much more than that, and much simpler than that, and more profound than that. But that too, I wanted to say along that lines. Now we're in the medical phase of life, where the actual grip that the church had for generations, it was upset by birth control, contraception in the around the time of the flower generation. In the time of the flower generation, my mother's generation, the hippie generation, the actual profundity of the hippies, but also the viability of the hippies, was because of contraception. The hippie lifestyles and activities and counter measures and resistance to the state apparatus by means of socializing, congregating, and coming together and enlightening one another in themselves. That would not have been possible without birth control present, contraception present, because people would have become pregnant, and they would have been beholden to the church and some of the grip that the church had on families historically and on people's minds by means of families, and what was convincing based on there being no way around pregnancy with people coming together. But that actual contraception, it actually changed life. It upended the status quo. It didn't end the status quo, but it upended and frustrated, and actually it contraception, it it both revolutionized life, human life, humanity, but it also revolutionized the status quo. And that too, the status quo became more from the church to the medical establishment that's still owned by the church. So the church never stopped having any of the control that it did, but it stepped up to and amounted to and changed by way of the times, because it's still part of the times. It's still comprised of human beings to be sophisticated, and it had to dispense with some of the old superstitions that also were being debunked simultaneously with the information age and the proliferation of information at all, and attitudes around information that were that some groundbreaking thinkers like Swami Vivekananda I've referenced, who came from India to America and made Hinduism respected as a world religion. He began some of the inroads and was followed by like the Theophist Society, and Krishnamurti, Jiddu Krishnamurti, an actual thought to be a messiah and a prodigy and a brilliant child specimen that was discovered by the Theophist Society, but he dissolved his own standing in there. But he was still a brilliant thinker that did a lot to change thought. So he actually, in a different way, in a vicarious way, he accomplished his actual mission to enlighten people and make the West more free thinking and viable and amenable to different faith walks and paths that would amount to different people's enlightenment. So you could say that he actually was what he was so called, even though he ostensibly paid lip service to dissolve it. He actually, in fact, was that. He had been trained in some of these well-to-do schools in England, and I don't know if they would have trained him to be as sophisticated consciously as what he did to dissolve his own standing and yet still accomplish his mission, or if that was communicated to him subliminally through his actual coding and messaging and inspiration of his preceptors in England that took him from India and bestowed on him great education and intellectual assets and abilities. I don't know if that would have been conscious or subconscious or both, but it actually he did exactly achieve what he set out to do and what he was likely programmed and inspired to do by the Theophist Society. Then to Arthur Avalon, who I reference a lot in here, a lot of our notions and understanding of yoga at all, but especially Kundalini and what's called the serpent power Kundalini rising, that a lot of the real workable knowledge of that was from Arthur Avalon, Sir John Woodroffe, as he transcribed that and was benefited by sages, gurus, fellow scholars, and aesthetics and hermits in India. And also he was an excellent student from, I think he was trained in England, and he was a justice of the High Court of India, and he was highly erudite and versed and dexterous and deft in the English language, and he was able to, and as a passion and pastime, he studied Bharata Dharma and yoga and Tantra also. And he's also, a lot of our notions, our true notions and understanding of Tantra, but also the popularity of Tantra is he's responsible for that too, with his books, Principles of Tantra, Volume 1 and 2. I extrapolate, and I would imagine that anyone who is competent in knowing about Tantra and or yoga and or Kundalini in strict proficient terms would have came across his works and been familiar with his works or benefited by his works. Then you had also Mahatma Gandhi, who was I think that he was I imagine that he would have been borrowed from or influenced by the Jaina people, because the Jaina people of India practice ahimsa, non-injury to any being. I got that word from Arthur Avalon, ahimsa, but that non-injury to any being amounts to the non-violent path that was picked up by Martin Luther King, and that he won with, and that he changed America and culture and the world with. Martin Luther King did that. but also for Martin Luther King to be open to, amenable, interested in anything of India at all. Mahatma Gandhi, the actual religious tolerance for that, I think that would have been cleared up a few decades before by the likes of at least Swami Vivekananda, maybe Daisetsu Suzuki from Japan, who was another American intellectual and tenured professor and scholar that was a big proponent of Zen and communicated a lot of Zen in his books. It said that some people they debate and dispute whether his iteration of Zen is actually what Zen had been and was in Japan to that point, or whether it's his own iteration and rendition of it. But he is an actual Japanese descendant and was proud of his Japanese heritage. But he was a proponent and enunciated a lot of Japanese tea ceremony, swordplay, meditation, and Zen. And so a lot of the things that would have been popular in the flower generation, Zen, open mind, and then also Gerald Gardner in the 1940s, who said that he was blessed by coming into a coven of Wicca people. He popularized and expounded upon Wicca, and I'm just saying that all these different things made the actually had been at play and converged by at least the time of the flower generations to make an actual suitable environment and climate for the open-mindedness. But all of that would have frustrated some of the old pretensions and or superstitions of the church and notions of sin. But it was actually neatly transcended and grafted into the medical establishment, so that now the medical establishment holds as much ironclad control and also superstition and weight in people's minds as the church did. So in the past, you could get someone, you could really look at someone as a non-viable, bogus entity by ascribing sin to them, by effectively associating sin to them, which would have it would have required the least of actual testimony of witnesses to confirm that, but also the least of behaviors and verbal statements and confessions. Now you can also relegate and dismiss someone to being equally as bogus in other people's eyes, and that to their own eyes, by leveling different by different mental illness diagnosis upon them, which are, according to Dr. Umar Johnson, an actual mental health diagnosis cannot be scientifically verified and is thereby as a professional opinion, just as the notion of sin would have been a religious opinion of a community but also clergy member. Now it's a community but also a medical establishment person. And these actual medical diagnoses, especially mental health, are as binding and permanent and chronic and actual condemning as an actual notion of sin, associating that with a person, and associating with things like demonism and devil worship and witchcraft would have been in the past. That's actually how drugs are now, and also mental health, mental illness now. That too, I read a book about witchcraft that said that the euphemism mental illness, it was actually it was coined by a witch hunter, a former witch hunter, and that's actually part of the old witch hunting. The actual term mental illness is a witch hunting coinage term, unit, and an operative word, and so too is it to this very day a witch hunting of marginal people, people that are naive and or gullible and or impressionable and or vulnerable enough to accept and also to wear and be beaten by up through and by their life by these diagnoses that are condemning, called from the medical establishment now. The actual same, that's actually part of the heritage, but also a vestigial. It's actually not vestigial. So like some things that we have, like human beings, we actually have like a tailbone. So we have like something called a sacrum, the bottom, the fusing of the bottom of your vertebrae below your pelvis. I think, or your sacral vertebrae. You have different vertebrae. You have your T vertebrae. So all mammals, so including giraffes, dolphins, whales, human beings, probably like, I think you'd call them like rodents, marsupials. All these different mammals, the actual vertebrae is the same structure and it has the same amount. So like both a giraffe and a human being have 7 cervical vertebrae. That's the vertebrae of your neck, the C vertebrae. Even a giraffe, even a whale, even a dolphin, even a human, even a seal probably too. have 7 cervical vertebrae. Then we have 12 thoracic vertebrae of our torso. That's like would be your chest and your lower back. Then you have your lumbar vertebrae, which is your lower back. Then you have your sacral vertebrae, which is like your pelvis and your lowest back, but it's significant because it's the terminal point of your nervous system from your brain. It's another node of your brain, and so because your brain is like lines of current, and it has to be grounded, and so your whole body corresponds to your vertebrae and is linked with your vertebrae. But the lower ones are the cervical vertebrae, but they're like a fusing. And the cervical vertebrae, the sacral vertebrae in humans would have been on par with and similar to the actual what the tailbone would be in other primates and apes. And but that would be called vestigial because we still have it as part of evolution, but for us it doesn't function. So we inherited it from some of our older iterations of existing in our bodies, but for now it doesn't have a purpose, but it still has a prominence. But that actual word mental illness is like that, except it's still viable. So it actually functioned through older iterations of feudal human society, that is the Roman Empire, in modern iterations, at least the last few fives of hundreds of years, but probably more as the church has been in sway. That actual witch hunting and marginalizing people, relegating them, condemning them, deleting their opportunities for happiness and progeny in one present life and hereafter, and when they're severed and from their own line and die without issue because of their marginalization. Dying without issue means dying without having a child. That some of those outcomes, the poverty of that, the deprivation of that, the suffering of that, the tormenting of that, the torture of that, like in medical institutions then and now, or maybe like prisons that would have been ran by a church, or heaven forbid, being burned at the stake. Nowadays, you can have your livelihood burned at the stake if you're called mentally ill. But that actual word itself, mental illness, was coined by a prominent witch hunter in America, and then it neatly lingered around, and it actually was reappropriated, repurposed now in the modern era, post contraception and birth control, but probably prior to that a little bit in the 20th century at least. And actually it still actually functions as a witch hunting word, and mitigates, mets out. Met means like delivers, it makes people suffer. It mets out the same actual deprivation and suffering and outcomes, by and large the same outcomes. That is to delete one's present livelihood, happiness, standing in community, respect, rapport in their own eyes, in the eyes of their community, the lack of social ties that would constitute, the lack of the experience of family, the lack of the experience of progeny, and hereafter. So that's actually the same thing happening in a modern iteration to modern scale, that the actual medical establishment is doing. But the reason I bring all that up is because, similar to the word drug, bastardizing, appropriating, mishandling what are entheogens, and the understanding of in which entheogens and human beings are actually the same thing. We as human beings are not viable without food, substance, that too also entheogens, because even if you have a strict diet of nuts and fruits and stuff like that, if you don't actually have entheogens that impact your sense of wellness, your sense of self, mind, will, and emotions, entheogens, they plant, animal, mineral substances that affect your mind, will, and emotions, your heart, that is, that you're actually not viably emotionally and personally and mentally without the least of entheogens, which is why I think a lot of young people and people at all struggle for, yearn for, reach out for, compromise their standing in life and sometimes their mind when mishandling what are called drugs, because there's an actual human need. It's a humane need to engage both food, substance where appropriate, but that too entheogens where appropriate. But the bastardization of entheogens as diluted, poorly sourced, unethically sourced, unethically handled, rendered, and experienced entheogens being as drugs, but then also the social stigma and also the tearing off and the scheduling and coding of repercussions, social repercussions, financial repercussions, professional, criminal repercussions, by means of calling things political repercussions, and deprivations and lack of subsidies and support by means of coining the word drug. All that is heavy work and heavy outcomes, profound outcomes, really heavy consequential outcomes in the human experience and destiny. The very word drug is like that, but so too is magic and witchcraft. So actually the purpose of this video was that I want to talk about actually magic in real life, in plain sight about us, amidst us, as not being superstitious, and not being far fetched in the least, and being consequential and actually perceptible, but sometimes having profound and heinous and unfortunate outcomes. And I want to talk about that a little bit, but the battery's going low on this, so I'm gonna recharge the battery, and then I'm gonna come back hopefully later tonight and and render what my purpose was in talking about magic that is influence, really influence. But I was talking in the beginning of this video about influence in terms of communication and perception. That's part of too, but not limited to what's called magic and actual magic is all of that: magi, image, perception, influence, but also in very simple things like sound, attention, sight, statements, and actual physical proximity, walking distance, posture, facing, and thought, and even things that happen on computers, because computers are so sophisticated and sensitive that some of these actual impacts of opposites attracting and like affecting like can actually happen by means of the digital space, and it's actually perceptible and appreciable. And there was an actual case in point episode that took place in a recent atrocity, where a person went to their was courted to their own death by some of their interactions online. That was referenced by the game spitter, and I wanted to actually cite that as a case in point of magic. A person had been beefing with another person, and actually went to that person's home looking to torment them or intimidate them, and actually was gunned down. But I want to say actually them being attracted to one another, these two people fighting like that, and this person actually appearing at would be the site of their own death at another person's home like that, another person's fortified position like that, is actually an example of magic and what it can actually mean to have an actual sincere, ardent intent to harm one the other or be harmed by one the other. That actual solemn intent, and actually the presence of firearms, because firearms are metal, which is significant spiritually, and also they render fire, which is both significant, very significant spiritually, metal and fire. What that can do to conscious attention, a person's mind, and a solemn thought, and a promise, and a threat, all those at play together with probably with practice and intention, and probably musicality with that, worship with that, that actually renders enough to actually attract a person to their own death, heaven forbid, as that happened, I think. But it can, that's an example of actual, really actually magic. And I wanted to talk about that episode, but it's going to take more bandwidth than I have battery for, so I'm going to recharge battery and come back with that in part two of this. But I just want to say what's up. Someone, I love my dog Dottie, said I am a they had some emoji. Lynn Howell said, what's up, Lynn Howell, what up? That's cool, you rock with your real name, or a real name at all. I want to say salute to that. And someone said, I love my dog. Dottie said, not much, and you, or maybe they are hot at each other. And then Quentin Drake, N6M, said, hi, what's up, Quentin Drake? And someone said, hi, how are you? So there's some more chat that it doesn't show me, so I can't see the other chat. But I just want to say what's up, and someone said hi. But thanks for rocking with this at all. And I got 2 likes, so I just want to say thanks for the likes, and I hope this can be of value or interest to anyone, because the best way to know if something's interesting is if it's interesting to you. So these things are interesting to me, and I see them happening a lot, so they have consequence to me, but likely other people, because like in class, whatever question you have, it impacts the rest of the class, and whatever has meaning to you, or whatever you can observe, is probably a impact affecting a lot of other people too. So I just want to make these statements like that. But I got more verses. Anything you actually say out your mouth, anything that you hear in life, is actually